Helen went to the mall to buy a gift for a friend, forced to take her daughter Lily along because the nanny had called in sick. The mall was alive with chatter, footsteps, and flashing lights. But Lily's attention was captured by a display of colorful toys. In a blink, she slipped away from her mother's side, lost in the wonder of the shop window. Helen didn't notice immediately. When she finally did, she began searching, not in panic, but with a cold, controlled calm, more concerned with appearances than with her daughter's safety. Meanwhile, Lily's small body trembled as silent tears ran down her cheeks. That's when Simon appeared. Kneeling to her level, he offered a warm, steady hand, speaking softly, guiding her through the crowd with a kindness so instinctive it almost felt protective. Together, they searched for her mother, each step a silent promise that she was not alone. 15 minutes later, Helen spotted them from across the busy corridor, Lily holding hands with Simon, a man she instantly judged, her mind clouded with fear and prejudice. She screamed, running toward them, snatching Lily as though Simon's touch had been poisonous. In front of everyone, she unleashed her venom, shaming him and accusing him of things that weren't true, while Lily's small voice trembled as she tried to explain that Simon was only trying to help. But Helen didn't listen. Simon said nothing, his eyes quietly observing, realizing that something much deeper and much darker was at play. What was really happening here? Why did Simon sense danger beneath the surface of this mother-daughter moment? The full story is far more shocking and revealing than anyone could imagine, but before we continue, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Now let's uncover how this story truly began. Helen crossed the polished marble floor of the upscale mall as if it were an inconvenience imposed on her, her heels striking sharply with every impatient step. Her grip on 6-year-old Lily's small wrist was firm, too firm, not out of fear of losing her, but out of irritation. This was not how Helen had planned her afternoon. Her usual nanny had called in sick, forcing her to do something she despised but would never admit out loud: spend time alone with her own child. "Hurry up," Helen muttered, barely glancing down. "I don't have all day." Lily stumbled slightly, trying to keep up, her short legs struggling to match her mother's pace. She wore a stiff, expensive dress that scratched her skin and shoes that pinched her toes. She didn't complain. She rarely did. She had learned that silence was safer. The mall was bright, immaculate, filled with glass storefronts and people who moved with quiet confidence. Helen pulled Lily into a luxury boutique and immediately launched into an argument with a sales assistant over the price of a silk scarf. Her voice was sharp, dismissive, laced with entitlement. "This is absurd," Helen snapped. "Do you know who I am?" The sales assistant smiled tightly, rehearsed politeness barely masking discomfort. While the adults spoke, Lily drifted toward the front of the store. Her eyes caught something that made her stop breathing for a moment. A toy shop across the corridor, its window filled with vintage dolls. Their glass eyes reflected the light softly. They looked gentle, safe. Without thinking, Lily took a step, then another. By the time Helen finished berating the employee and turned around, the space beside her was empty. She froze, not in panic, but in annoyance. "Lily?" she called, her tone flat, irritated. She scanned the boutique, then stepped into the corridor, eyes darting not with maternal fear, but with calculation. People were watching. This was embarrassing. Across the mall, Lily stood alone, suddenly aware of how small she was. The noise felt louder now, the ceilings higher. Her chest tightened. She hugged her arms around herself, her eyes filling with tears she tried desperately not to let fall. Crying only made things worse. That was when a man knelt in front of her. "Hey," Simon said softly, lowering himself to her eye level so he wouldn't seem threatening. He wore jeans and a simple t-shirt, his expression calm, warm. "Are you okay?" Lily nodded, then shook her head, confusion overwhelming her. Her lip trembled. I can't find my mom. That's scary," Simon replied gently. "But you're not in trouble. We'll find her together." He offered her a bottle of water, unscrewing the cap first, careful and patient. When she took it with both hands, their fingers brushed. She didn't flinch. Something about him felt safe, familiar, in a way she didn't understand. As they walked slowly through the mall, Simon kept his pace measured, never pulling, never rushing. He told her a silly joke about a dog who tried to shop for shoes and bought a hat instead. Lily let out a small laugh before she could stop herself, then looked up at him in surprise, as if laughter were something forbidden. They hadn't gone far when Helen saw them. Her reaction was immediate and explosive. "What are you doing?" she screamed, sprinting toward them. She yanked Lily out of Simon's grasp with force, her nails digging into the child's arm. "Get your dirty hands off my daughter!" The mall fell silent. People turned. Phones appeared. Helen grabbed a sanitizer wipe from her purse and scrubbed Lily's hand aggressively, as if trying to erase contamination. Lily winced, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "This man tried to steal my child!" Helen shouted. "Disgusting!" Simon raised his hands slowly, his voice steady despite the heat burning in his chest. "Ma'am," she was crying. "I was just helping. People like you always are," Helen cut in, her lip curling with contempt. "Stay away from us, or I'll call security to drag you back to the streets where you belong." Lily looked back at Simon as her mother pulled her away. Her eyes were filled not with fear of him, but with something far more heartbreaking apology. Simon stood there, surrounded by whispers and judgment, watching them disappear into the crowd. His jaw tightened, his fists clenched at his sides, not in anger that sought violence, but in pain that demanded meaning. Some moments don't pass. They stay, and this one stayed. Simon remained rooted to the cold tiles of the mall corridor, his body rigid, but not from fear, rigid from a simmering, silent fury that gnawed him from the inside. His fists clenched, not with the desire to strike, but as though grasping at the injustice that hung heavily in the air. His gaze followed Helen as she yanked Lily's tiny arm with unnecessary force. Each tug, each sharp word resonated in his chest like a punch. His stomach churned at the sight, and yet Simon did not move forward. He could not, for now, not with the crowd watching, not with the potential for misinterpretation. But every fiber of him screamed against the cruelty he was witnessing. Lily's small, frightened face was turned not toward her mother, not toward the woman who claimed to be her guardian, but back at Simon. The apology and hurt in her eyes were raw, aching. The weight of those eyes pressed into him, cutting through the formalities of his life, stripping away the calm exterior that everyone around him was used to seeing. He could feel the child's silent question hanging there. "Why is she like this? Why am I so alone?" Helen's voice cut through the mall's hum of footsteps and soft music, sharp as a whip. "You embarrassed me," she hissed. "Don't you ever talk to those kinds of people again?" Her words, laced with venom, echoed in the corridor. They were not mere warnings, they were indoctrinations. The subtle, pervasive poison of her prejudice began to wrap itself around Lily's impressionable mind. Simon felt his chest tighten, a hollow ache settling in. How could anyone so young, so innocent, be taught to see humanity as a threat? The harsh fluorescent lights of the parking lot greeted them as Helen dragged Lily out, her high heels clicking a rapid, impatient rhythm on the concrete. Lily stumbled against the uneven pavement, her small fingers twisting in her mother's grip, desperate for release, desperate for comfort. But Helen's eyes were fixed elsewhere on her own reflection in the car window, on the image of herself she wished the world would see. Her anger shifted seamlessly, now directed at her child. "I swear, one day you'll make me the laughingstock," she spat, her voice hard, brittle, like breaking glass. "Do you understand what happens to children who embarrass their mothers?" Lily flinched, nodding silently, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. Simon's heart ached, each silent sob in the girl reverberating in his chest. Helen's phone buzzed inside her designer bag. She answered, her tone clipped and sharp. "What is it now?" "Ms. Helen, I have to tell you, your credit cards are maxed out." "The charge is far beyond the limit," the accountant's voice stammered on the other end, a mixture of concern and urgency. Helen's lips curled into a disdainful smile, her voice rising with confidence rather than worry. "It doesn't matter. Not at all. I'm about to sign the deal of a lifetime with SS Company. This will secure everything. My social standing, my influence, my life as it should be." She hung up without waiting for a reply, her focus already returning to the glossy black car in the parking lot. Simon didn't move from his hidden vantage point. He watched Helen slide Lily into the passenger seat, the child shrinking into the small corner of the leather seat, trying to disappear. The engine roared, and the car sped off, leaving the muted echoes of the parking lot behind. But Simon did not simply return to his own life, to the safety and isolation of his wealth and influence. No, the gut feeling that had ignited within him refused to be ignored. He memorized the license plate, committing it to memory with a precision born of discipline and urgency. His mind cataloged every detail: the make of the car, the scratches along the bumper, the angle of the driver's seat, the scent of expensive perfume lingering as the door closed. Every piece of information mattered. Back at his own modest sedan, Simon settled into the worn leather seat and exhaled slowly. The vehicle, unremarkable and quiet, contrasted sharply with the life he usually occupied, a conscious choice to stay low profile. He dialed a number he knew by heart. When the investigator answered, his voice dropped, calm but commanding, a tone of steel wrapped in concern. "I need a full background check on the owner of a black SUV. She is likely traveling with a child who may be at risk. I want everything: financials, legal history, any patterns of behavior that could indicate neglect or abuse." As night fell, the city lights flickered on, casting a golden glow that bounced off glass towers and illuminated the streets far below. Simon sat in his penthouse, a glass of untouched water cooling on the marble table beside him, and stared down at the teeming life below. The image of Lily's eyes, wide, fearful, apologetic, refused to leave his mind. It lingered, a painful imprint he could not erase. He felt a storm of helplessness and determination collide within him. The girl deserved safety, kindness, love, the things that Helen had failed to provide. Simon leaned back, his hands tightening over the armrests of his chair, knuckles whitening. He allowed himself a moment to imagine a future where Lily was free from fear, free from the cruelty that had so casually brushed against her childhood. A future where her laughter was not stolen, where her small hands could touch others without dread. He made a silent vow, a promise that felt heavier than any boardroom contract he had ever signed. If that little girl was being mistreated, he would wield every ounce of his power, every resource, every connection, to ensure she was safe. And in that solemn moment, amidst the glimmering city and the quiet hum of night, Simon felt a profound truth settle into his chest. Sometimes, being powerless in one moment is the catalyst for change in the next. He would not let the silence of injustice remain unbroken. 2 days had passed since the unsettling incident at the mall. Yet the memory of Lily's wide, apologetic eyes haunted Simon as he stepped into the SS Company headquarters. The building was alive with motion. Interns hustled past with clipboards. Delivery men wheeled carts of fabrics through polished corridors, and the soft hum of conversation and printers filled every space with a sense of organized chaos. Despite the company's bustling energy, Simon's presence was calm, almost understated, like a still point amid the tide. He walked past the sleek glass doors and immediately greeted the janitorial staff, pausing by a man pushing a mop. "Good morning, Jorge. "How's your daughter's recital coming along?" he asked, his voice warm, devoid of pretense. Jorge blinked, momentarily stunned, then smiled broadly. "She nailed it last weekend, sir. Thank you for asking." Simon nodded and moved on to the next custodian, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a broom tucked under her arm. "Maria, how's your husband doing? And the twins?" Each question, each genuine concern, hung in the air, a small but unmistakable mark of respect for those too often overlooked. In this way, Simon's actions spoke louder than any boardroom speech. Every human deserved dignity. Every life mattered. He finally reached his office, where Marcus, his assistant, was waiting. Marcus's expression was a mixture of excitement and professional caution. "Simon, the new candidate for the face of SS's fashion, is arriving today. Everything looks perfect on paper. She's a high society mother, polished, represents elegance, family values. The proposal is flawless." He slid a tablet across the desk, displaying images of Helen in staged family portraits, carefully curated social media posts, and glowing write-ups from charity events she claimed to attend. Simon's gaze lingered on the images, scanning the smiles that seemed too practiced, the eyes that didn't quite reach the camera. Normally, he trusted the evaluations provided by his team without question. Casting and public representation were rarely his concern. Yet, something tugged at him, a faint intuition, an uneasy whisper that he could not ignore. "Marcus," Simon said, his voice deliberate, controlled, yet layered with an unusual gravity. "I want to sit in on the meeting. I need to see her for myself. I need to know if the woman behind the facade truly embodies the values we claim to represent." Marcus raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He had long since learned that Simon's instincts were rarely misguided. Meanwhile, across town, Helen's morning was a flurry of calculated frenzy. In the grand bedroom of her apartment, she paced back and forth as Lily sat rigidly on a velvet chair, trying to fold her small hands in her lap. Helen held up an extravagant, stiff dress, the material itchy against her fingers. "Hurry up, Lily! This is your life we're presenting today. Do you understand? Every word you say matters. Every smile must be perfect. If you mess up, you won't get your toys tonight." "Not one," she snapped, her voice sharp, cutting through the quiet light glass. Lily swallowed nervously, nodding repeatedly. She had learned early that disobedience, even unintentional, carried consequences. As Helen fussed with the dress, adjusting collars and hemlines, she recited a rehearsed script over and over. "We are a perfect family. I am loved. My mother and I are devoted to each other. Our life is happy. Our home is safe." The words felt hollow, heavy with pretense, and each repetition made Lily's chest tighten further. The weight of expectation pressing down like a vice. Finally satisfied, or perhaps just eager to leave, Helen bundled Lily into the back of a sleek black car and sped toward the SS Company headquarters. The child's small fingers were clenched tightly around her mother's, holding on out of habit, out of learned fear. Helen's attention was consumed by her own concerns. The waiting room chairs, the receptionist's supposed incompetence, the water that had not been chilled to her preference. She barked commands and complaints, her voice sharp and untempered, oblivious to the cameras mounted discreetly around the lobby, silently recording every moment. As the minutes ticked by, Helen paused in front of a tall mirror near the entrance. She adjusted her hair, flattened the collar of her designer jacket, and practiced her smile. It was an exercise she had perfected over years of social scrutiny. Eyes slightly widened, lips curved in precise upward motion, teeth just barely visible. She nodded to herself, convinced that the world would see what she wanted it to see, a composed, sophisticated mother, ready to take her rightful place in the spotlight. Beneath that polished exterior, however, there was a knot of anxiety that Simon, if he were watching, might have recognized. The lobby was quiet now, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning and the muted click of high heels on marble. Helen stood tall, exuding confidence, but her fingers twitched as though anticipating confrontation, as though the world were always a threat to her carefully constructed image. She had no idea that the room ahead, the very boardroom she coveted, would soon expose truths she had spent a lifetime burying, truths she could neither polish nor erase. Simon, miles away yet unshakable in his resolve, would soon witness the performance, yet he would also recognize the undercurrent of fragility, fear, and cruelty that lurked beneath Helen's rehearsed veneer. And in that recognition, the stage was being set, not merely for a contract signing, but for the revelation of character, the unmasking of pretension, and the beginning of justice for a little girl whose eyes had already been scarred by the world. Helen stepped into the grand boardroom of SS Company with the poise of someone who had rehearsed this moment countless times in her mind. The polished mahogany table gleamed under the soft, ambient lighting, surrounded by executives who waited expectantly, their eyes polite but watchful. She forced a smile onto her face, the kind that suggested warmth and sincerity, while her mind raced through a carefully curated narrative. Her voice, smooth and confident, floated across the room as she spoke of charity work she had never truly done, of late nights she claimed to spend nurturing her child, of sacrifices made for family and social duty. Every word was measured, every inflection designed to project perfection. Lily sat in the corner, her small frame barely noticeable beneath the oversized chair, the itchy dress constricting her movements. Her eyes were wide, dark pools of fear and confusion. She clutched her little hands together, trying to make herself invisible, while the polished atmosphere of wealth and power felt like an oppressive wall around her. The tension in her shoulders, the slight tremor in her lips, were invisible to Helen, who was entirely absorbed in her performance. Helen dipped her pen and began signing a preliminary form, eyes fixed on the paper as though it held the key to her salvation. The sound of ink scratching against fine parchment filled the room, a mundane noise that somehow magnified the anticipation. She did not notice the slight shift in the air, the almost imperceptible change in the rhythm of the room as the door opened. Simon entered quietly, yet the moment he stepped inside, it was as if the room's energy shifted. He wore a custom-tailored suit that fit him perfectly, the dark fabric sharp and commanding, and yet his presence was understated, confident without arrogance. He walked with a measured, controlled grace, his eyes scanning the room, noting faces, postures, the subtle interactions of those gathered. Helen did not look up immediately. Her attention was still on the contract, on the ink flowing across the paper. She did not recognize him at first. She assumed he was a waiter, a discreet assistant bringing coffee, and allowed herself a smirk, the kind that suggested amusement at the staff. Then her gaze shifted. The recognition hit her like a sudden chill. Her pencil hovered in midair, the tip trembling slightly. Simon's eyes, calm and deliberate, met hers from across the room. "Oh, look," she said, laughter forced and high-pitched, directed toward the board rather than at Simon. Her tone was casual, practiced. "You have a very diverse hiring policy for the help. This man harassed me at the mall just the other day." Her words were meant to belittle, to assert her status, but they carried an unexpected weight. The room went deathly silent. The executive's eyes shifted between Helen and Simon, confusion and disbelief etching their features. Some leaned slightly forward, others froze, unsure of how to respond. Simon raised a hand, deliberate, a single, fluid motion that commanded attention without aggression. His face was a mask of calm authority, unreadable, yet undeniably present. His eyes never wavered, never darted, holding her gaze with quiet power. Helen, sensing the pause, the silence that seemed to magnify her words, grew emboldened. She pressed on, her voice sharper now, attempting to assert dominance in this space that suddenly felt uncertain. "I hope you checked his background," she said, the words dripping with accusation. "I wouldn't leave him alone with the handbags, let alone the guests." Her smile, meant to be charming, faltered slightly as she saw the subtle shift in Simon's posture, the way his body seemed to occupy the space with silent authority. Simon moved slowly, deliberately, toward the chair at the head of the table, the CEO's chair. Each step was measured, purposeful, an unspoken assertion that he owned not just the space, but the situation itself. He sat down with deliberate care, folding his hands neatly on the polished mahogany surface. The sound of the chair settling was faint but resonant, marking the final act in a silent prelude. He looked at Helen, not with anger, but with a piercing clarity that made her heart skip. His gaze was steady, unwavering, as if he were peering directly into the deepest recesses of her soul. For a moment, Helen felt the weight of the room pressing down on her, the illusions she had so carefully crafted suddenly fragile, transparent. The board members watched, breath held, as the dynamics of power shifted. Simon's presence was quiet, but commanding. A force not of intimidation, but of integrity and moral certainty. Every fiber of his being communicated that he was in control, not through aggression, but through the undeniable truth of his authority and the moral rightness that accompanied it. Lily, seated in the corner, sensed the shift, too. Her tiny body straightened slightly, her eyes wide but not with fear. There was a subtle relief, a flicker of safety in the room now that Simon was present. A silent acknowledgement that this man, who had knelt to comfort her at the mall, could also command the power of the world around him. Helen's smirk faltered. The smothering confidence she had carried into the room now felt tenuous, fragile, as if the ground beneath her social posturing were giving way. The carefully constructed narrative of perfect motherhood, of elegance, of charm, trembled against the quiet but undeniable truth Simon's presence brought. She realized, somewhere deep within herself, that this was no longer a room where lies could hold sway. And in that silence, that weight-filled pause, the stage was set for confrontation, not merely of words, but of character, of truth, and of justice. The boardroom, once a stage for business and polished facades, had transformed into a crucible where the masks of pretense would be revealed, and the fragile threads of genuine human dignity would begin to reassert themselves. The boardroom seemed to exhale in unison as Simon finally broke the silence. His voice was low, yet carried an undeniable weight, a resonance that made the air itself feel heavier. "Ms. Helen," he began, his tone calm but unwavering, "I believe you haven't met the owner of SS Company. You've been busy insulting him." The words landed like a hammer. Helen froze mid-sentence, the pen hovering over the paper, her perfectly manicured fingers tightening involuntarily. Her practiced composure faltered, and the color drained from her face as the truth settled in, creeping cold and unrelenting into every crevice of her mind. Recognition struck. The man she had so casually insulted, the one she had accused of theft, the one she had deemed beneath her, was the very owner of the empire she had been desperate to impress. Her breath caught. I. It was a misunderstanding," she stammered, her voice quivering slightly, betraying the cracks in her carefully constructed mask. Simon's gaze, however, did not waver. His dark eyes, steady and penetrating, seemed to see into the deepest recesses of her soul. There was no anger there, no hatred, only clarity, a precise and unyielding acknowledgement of the truth. "You called my hands dirty," he said, his voice carrying a quiet intensity. He placed his hands deliberately on the contract before him, the contrast stark against Helen's accusations. Yet these hands built this empire. And these hands, he continued, his tone softening slightly, were the only ones willing to dry your daughter's tears when you abandoned her. The room held its collective breath. The air was thick, charged with tension, every eye drawn to Helen's reaction. She opened her mouth to reply, to spin some narrative of stress, of overwork, of a momentary lapse, but the words died before they could leave her lips. Simon's presence, steady and commanding, made her excuses feel feeble, hollow, insufficient, sufficient. With deliberate calm, Simon reached into the tablet beside him and gestured toward the screen. The reception footage played on the display, Helen berating the front desk staff, her voice sharp, dismissive, untempered. The executives leaned forward, eyes widening as the footage made plain the gap between the image Helen had cultivated and the reality of her actions. Her behavior was not a one-time lapse. It was a pattern. Each scornful remark, each condescending glance, each moment of entitlement revealed her character, unvarnished and unflinching. Lily, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, her small body tense, now reacted instinctively. At the sight of Simon, the man who had knelt to her at the mall, who had offered her comfort and kindness when she felt most alone, she slid off her chair and ran toward him. She pressed herself against his legs, hiding, seeking the safety she had never known in Helen's presence. Simon's hands reached down, gently resting on her shoulders, his body forming an unspoken shield. Helen's reaction was immediate and primal. She lunged for her daughter, desperation and entitlement mingling in a volatile mix. But Simon, tall and unwavering, stood between them, his presence both protective and commanding. Helen's fingers brushed Lily's sleeve, but he did not flinch. His eyes, calm and measured, met hers. "The deal is off," Simon said, his voice firm, deliberate, each word striking with the weight of moral authority. He tore the contract in half, the paper falling like fragile confessions onto the polished mahogany. "SS Company represents luxury," he continued, each syllable measured, "but true luxury is kindness. You, madam, are spiritually bankrupt." Helen's composure shattered. Her lips trembled, then curled into a scream, a high, desperate wail that filled the room with raw emotion. Rage, humiliation, and panic collided within her, a storm finally unrestrained. Words tumbled from her mouth with the ferocity of years of unacknowledged prejudice. Slurs, accusations, venom that revealed the depths of her racism in unfiltered clarity. The executives recoiled, their faces mirrors of disbelief and shock. Some shifting uncomfortably in their chairs, unable to reconcile the image of the polished candidate with the venom now laid bare. For a brief moment, the room was suspended in the tension of exposure. Helen, red-faced and trembling, seemed dwarfed by the moral weight of Simon's presence and the innocence of the small girl clinging to him. The contrast could not have been more stark. One woman clinging to falsehood and entitlement, the other standing resolute, grounded in truth and compassion. Lily's small fingers tightened around Simon's trouser leg, and he lowered his gaze, meeting hers with quiet reassurance. "It's okay, Lily," he whispered, soft but firm. "You're safe now. You're never alone again." The tremor in her shoulders began to ease, the fear slowly replaced by a tentative, fragile relief. Simon looked around the room once more, his voice calm but carrying undeniable authority. "True value," he said, "is measured not by wealth, not by appearances, not by power over others. It is measured by the respect, care, and integrity you extend to those who cannot defend themselves. That is what SS Company represents. Anything less is meaningless." Helen's scream dwindled, replaced by stammering attempts at protest that fell flat against the weight of the truth. She could feel the finality of her failure pressing down, her social aspirations crumbling in real time. Yet amidst her humiliation, the room felt lighter, as if a burden long ignored had finally been lifted. Justice, patient and deliberate, had been served. Lily, eyes wide and trusting, peeked out from behind Simon's legs. For the first time that day, she allowed herself a small, hesitant smile, a smile untainted by fear, a glimpse of hope and the possibility of care and love that she had been denied. Simon knelt slightly to her level, brushing a stray lock of hair from her forehead, and whispered, "You're safe. You've always deserved to be safe." And in that quiet moment, amidst the shattered illusions and the exposed truths, the boardroom transformed from a place of ambition and pretense into a space where integrity, compassion, and human dignity reigned supreme. The humiliation reversed, the scales of justice tipping in favor of the innocent, and the first seeds of a new beginning were quietly, profoundly sown. The boardroom doors opened and security stepped inside, their polished shoes echoing against the marble floor. They moved with practiced efficiency, prepared to remove Helen from the space she had so recklessly claimed as her own. Yet Simon raised a hand, halting them mid-step. The gesture was calm, almost imperceptible, but it carried an unmistakable authority. He was not finished. Justice was far from complete. Helen's face, still flushed from anger and humiliation, froze at the unexpected pause. Her chest heaved as she tried to regain composure, but Simon's presence, steady and unwavering, demanded truth. He reached for a thick folder lying neatly on the table, the edges crisp, the contents meticulously organized. With deliberate care, he opened it and let the papers fan out before him, the light catching the stark black text on pristine white pages. "You mentioned you were facing bankruptcy," he said, his voice even, calm, yet resonating with power. He looked at her with an unsettling clarity, as though he could see every thought twisting behind her practiced mask. "I know about your debts. I know you leveraged your house to maintain your image." The words hit her like cold water. Helen's eyes darted, searching the room as if for some escape, some last unseen card she could play. Her nails dug into her palms, the painted tips pressing into the soft flesh, yet no comfort came. Simon's gaze remained fixed, unyielding, yet without malice. There was no desire to humiliate for amusement. This was accountability, measured, inevitable, and precise. Helen's knees buckled under the weight of realization. She fell, the polished heels of her designer shoes scraping against the marble, and she sank to the floor with a thud that resonated painfully in her own ears. Her voice cracked, a mixture of fear, desperation, and raw disbelief spilling out in urgent pleas. "Please, you can't. I'll do anything." She swayed slightly, clutching at the hem of her dress, the fabric itching and suffocating against her skin. The arrogance she had worn like armor evaporated instantly, replaced by something pitiful. Something almost unrecognizable. A woman stripped bare of pride, revealed as nothing more than greed and self-interest. Simon, seated calmly at the head of the table, allowed the silence to linger, the room holding its collective breath. Then, in a voice soft yet firm, he revealed the first twist, a maneuver that was both strategic and merciful. "When I ran your license plates and discovered your financial situation," he said, his hands moving over the documents with meticulous care, "my holding company purchased your debt this morning. Technically, Helen, I now own your house and all your assets." Helen's jaw dropped, her scream stifled into a whimper as reality sank in. Her eyes, wide and pleading, reflected a fear that had nothing to do with the boardroom, nothing to do with business, and everything to do with the crumbling illusion of control. She clasped her hands together, rocking slightly on the cold floor, murmuring incomprehensible promises, desperate bargains that fell on deaf ears. Her voice, once commanding, now trembled. I can pay it back. I'll work. Just, please." Simon leaned forward, his hands resting on the table, and for the first time, a hint of pity colored his expression. There was no malice in his eyes, no schadenfreude. Only clarity and compassion, tempered by the undeniable necessity of accountability. "I am not going to evict you immediately," he said gently. You will have the chance to work off your debt. In our warehouse, packing boxes, at minimum wage. Helen froze. The words barely registered at first. Packing boxes? Minimum wage? The very thought was anathema, a stark collision between her world of ease and privilege and the reality of labor. She could not fathom it, the humiliation, the loss of status, the exposure to an existence she had long ignored. Her lips parted, then trembled as she found herself incapable of even protesting. Simon's voice, calm but unwavering, filled the tense space. This is your choice, Helen. You can either face absolute homelessness, stripped of everything, or you can work. You can learn the value of $1, and perhaps the humility that comes with understanding that life is more than appearances. Her eyes darted to the contract remnants, to the executives, to the silent security guards, to the child, her child still clinging to Simon. And yet, in that moment, she realized something she had never considered. She had not asked if Lily was okay. Her own daughter, terrified and trembling only days before, still found solace in the arms of another man. The awareness struck her like a blade. The weight of neglect, of entitlement, of obsession with social image bore down on her like a storm. Helen's knees scraped against the floor as tears slid unbidden down her cheeks, mingling with sweat, frustration, and the bitter taste of failure. She wept not for herself, not truly, but for the sudden, stark realization of her own moral and emotional bankruptcy. Yet even as she cried, she could not reach Lily, could not soothe the child who had looked to her for guidance, only to be abandoned in emotional neglect. Simon remained calm, a steady anchor in the tempest of her collapse. He looked down at Lily, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead, whispering gently, "You're safe now. You don't need to be afraid." The small girl's grip tightened around his waist, her face pressed against his side, drawing comfort from a man who had never claimed the role of parent but had embodied its essence through care, attention, and unwavering moral integrity. The room held a profound silence, broken only by the soft sobs of Helen and the quiet reassurances Simon offered Lily. The contrast could not have been starker, one life unmoored by greed and self-absorption, another defined by compassion, courage, and protective instinct. In that silence, there was not just punishment, but opportunity, a chance for Helen to begin a journey she had long evaded, to confront humility, and perhaps, one day, to understand the deeper truths of value, kindness, and responsibility. And in that moment, Simon's voice, steady and measured, carried a quiet, unspoken message. Justice was not cruelty, nor revenge, but the careful alignment of truth and mercy. Lily, clinging to him, began to understand that protection and care could exist in a world that had previously seemed cruel and indifferent. And Helen, kneeling on the cold floor for the first time, truly confronted the consequences of a life lived for appearances rather than substance. Helen's shoulders sagged with exhaustion, defeat, and an almost tangible weight of humiliation as she muttered her reluctant agreement to work in the warehouse. Her voice was low, trembling with a mixture of disbelief and despair, her words faltering, "Fine, I'll do it. I'll take the job. Just give me instructions." She did not raise her eyes, afraid to meet Simon's, afraid of the calm certainty in his gaze that would further strip away the layers of pretense she had so carefully constructed. Simon's eyes remained on her for a moment, steady, measuring, almost contemplative. Then he turned slightly to Marcus, who had been standing quietly near the boardroom entrance, ready but unobtrusive. A subtle nod, imperceptible to most in the room, was all it took. Marcus's hand moved toward the side panel of the doors, unlocking them with a soft click that seemed louder than it should have in the tense stillness. Slowly, the grand doors swung open, revealing 3 figures who immediately drew the attention of every person in the room. A social worker, compassionate but authoritative, and 2 police officers, their uniforms crisp, their expressions serious but calm. Helen's head snapped up, the motion sudden, instinctive, full of defensive reflex. Her eyes widened in confusion, a mixture of anger and disbelief flickering across her features. What is this?" she demanded, her voice sharper than she intended, betraying the rising panic that gnawed at the edges of her composure. Simon's voice, calm, yet resonant with moral authority, filled the room. "Helen," he said slowly, deliberately, "this was never about the contract." His gaze softened as it fell upon Lily, who had quietly tucked herself behind Simon's legs, peeking out with wide, uncertain eyes. "This was about ensuring Lily's safety. The investigation we conducted, it was never for financial gain. It was to protect the child who deserved care, protection, and love, things she has been denied for far too long." The social worker stepped forward, her expression measured yet empathetic, and Simon continued, his voice breaking ever so slightly, carrying the weight of both authority and genuine emotion. "Our private investigator reviewed mall security footage and corroborated reports from neighbors. They documented incidents of physical shaking, neglect, and verbal abuse. This is not conjecture. This is evidence. And it paints a clear picture of a child at risk." Helen's body stiffened. Her lips parted, her breath hitching, but it was not remorse that surfaced, it was anger. A fierce, protective-like fury over what she considered her rights. Her hands shot out toward Lily, desperate, trembling. "No, she's my property. She's mine," she screamed, her voice rising with panic and indignation, echoing harshly against the mahogany walls. Her words were frantic, almost unhinged, but beneath the fear and anger lay something else. The unmasked truth of her moral and emotional failings. Simon did not move aggressively. He remained calm, resolute, embodying the very protection and stability that Lily had craved. The police officers stepped in smoothly, their presence commanding but unobtrusive, forming a human barrier between Helen and the child. One officer, tall and composed, met her gaze firmly. "Children are not property, ma'am," he said, his tone unwavering. Then, with practiced efficiency, he reached for Helen's wrists, securing the handcuffs over her protests and struggles, the metal clicking shut with the sound that seemed to mark the finality of accountability. Helen's protests became cries, shrill and desperate, echoing off the walls and filling the boardroom with a raw display of panic and disbelief. She twisted and fought, the chaos of her own making unfolding with every frantic motion. But Simon remained poised, protective, his presence a steadfast anchor for Lily, who clung to him as though sensing that the storm could not touch her while she was close to him. In the midst of the chaos, Lily's small voice broke through, soft, trembling, yet filled with hope. Will you be my dad now?" she whispered, barely audible over Helen's screams and the commotion. The words were innocent, tender, and filled with a poignant yearning that resonated through the room like a fragile melody. Simon's eyes softened immediately, his expression shifting from authority to something more human, more profoundly emotional. He knelt slightly to meet her gaze, brushing a stray strand of hair from her forehead, and spoke gently, "Yes, Lily, if you'll have me, I will be your dad. I promise you, always." The simplicity and sincerity of his words struck the executives, the social worker, and even the police officers in attendance. They watched in awe and silent reverence as a child, who had spent her life in fear and uncertainty, was offered something she had never truly known: unwavering care, protection, and love. Helen, still struggling, felt the weight of her failures press down harder than ever before. Her child had not cried for her, had not begged for her, had instead sought solace in the arms of another, arms that represented security, morality, and compassion she had never provided. The realization hit her with a cold, paralyzing clarity. Every choice, every insult, every act of selfishness had led her here, and her authority over Lily had been irrevocably stripped away. As the officers guided her toward the exit, Helen's shrieks reverberated, but her eyes caught one last glimpse of the child she had failed. Lily's small hands rested on Simon's arms, her face alight with trust and fragile joy. Simon bent down, holding Lily close without lifting her from the floor, whispering reassurances that were soft yet deeply resonant. "You are safe. You are loved. And you will never be alone again." The boardroom seemed to exhale, the tension dissipating slowly as the reality of protection, justice, and care settled over those present. What had begun as a confrontation, an exposure of greed and entitlement, had transformed into a moment of profound human connection, catharsis, and the first step toward healing. The child, previously voiceless and frightened, had found a protector, and the lessons of accountability, truth, and moral courage had been seared indelibly into those who witnessed it. Even as Helen was escorted out, kicking and screaming, her rage and disbelief fading into distant echoes, the sight of Lily safe, comforted, and smiling faintly through tears, left an indelible mark. The small child's vulnerability had been met with steadfast compassion, proving that true power lay not in wealth or entitlement, but in the courage to protect, to nurture, and to act with unwavering integrity. In that quiet, emotionally charged moment, the boardroom became more than a stage for business or pretense. It became a testament to human dignity, the enduring value of empathy, and the transformative impact of care extended without prejudice. Lily, small but radiant with newfound trust, clung to Simon as though understanding, in her own innocent way, that life had finally offered her the beginning of the love she had always deserved. His grand boardroom had barely emptied when the reverberations of the confrontation spilled outward into the lobby. Helen, still in handcuffs, struggled against the police officers holding her, her voice rising in shrill protest, desperate for attention, desperate for validation. The elegant space, usually reserved for appointments with high-profile clients and carefully orchestrated press moments, now bore witness to chaos. Her cries echoed off the marble walls, piercing the air with a mix of panic, entitlement, and fury. Reporters who had gathered in anticipation of the announcement for the new face of SS were suddenly thrust into a spectacle far beyond the expected press release. Cameras clicked, microphones hovered, and every movement, every utterance, was captured with ruthless immediacy. Helen's face, contorted with rage, flushed crimson as she accused Simon with wild, unrestrained words. "He stole my child. That black CEO, he has no right. You've all been fooled by him, but I know what he is. He can't take my daughter from me." Her voice cracked, rising and falling like a storm, the desperation behind it betraying the thin veneer of sophistication she had carefully maintained for so long. Her hysteria, fueled by the dual shocks of her financial ruin and the exposure of her moral failures, created a spectacle that drew gasps from the press and whispers of disbelief from the onlookers. A young reporter, sensing the magnitude of the moment, adjusted her camera and focused on Helen's flailing form. The recording began to capture not only the raw spectacle, but the words that would reverberate far beyond the marble walls. Accusations, shrieks, and bitter slurs. Within minutes, the video was uploaded, shared, and seen across social media platforms. Yet, contrary to Helen's hopes of eliciting sympathy or outrage against Simon, the public response was instantaneous and overwhelming, but in the opposite direction. Viewers were shocked, appalled by her behavior, her uncontrolled anger, and the underlying cruelty that had been laid bare. The video quickly went viral, spreading across feeds and timelines, accompanied by commentary that contextualized the events. People began sharing previously obscure posts, pictures, and stories, old social media updates showing Helen belittling service workers, clips of her publicly scolding employees, neighbors' accounts of her neglect, and evidence of behavior that reflected entitlement and abuse. The collective response was furious, outraged, and deeply judgmental, cementing the magnitude of her downfall. Helen, who had believed herself untouchable, saw the empire of social perception she had carefully built crumble within hours, shattered by the very transparency she had failed to anticipate. In contrast, Simon watched the unfolding storm from the calm of his office, his gaze steady as he observed the digital firestorm. He felt no joy in the destruction of Helen's reputation, no triumph in witnessing the fall of someone who had caused harm. His satisfaction was muted, tempered by a profound sense of relief. The immediate threat to Lily had been neutralized. The child, vulnerable and previously unprotected, was safe. That certainty, fragile yet steadfast, provided a quiet peace that no viral controversy could overshadow. Simon shifted in his chair and looked down at Lily, who had settled comfortably on the sofa beside him. Her small hand rested in his, fingers curled with trust, a gentle anchor in the turbulent aftermath. The social worker sat nearby, her expression both professional and empathetic, as she reviewed the arrangements necessary to secure Lily's future. Simon's influence had ensured that the child would not be subjected to the impersonal, frightening uncertainty of a typical foster system. His presence had allowed for a controlled, compassionate process, temporary safety, careful oversight, and the opportunity to connect Lily with those who could provide stability and love. Yet, despite the resources, despite the layers of protection he had assembled, Simon felt a subtle, poignant pang of helplessness. Money could not solve every problem. Influence could not erase every scar. The social worker, gentle yet direct, broke the news that even with his intervention, Lily would have to spend some time in the system temporarily. There was no relative to assume immediate custody, no familial anchor strong enough to bypass the mandated procedures entirely. Simon's jaw tightened, a silent testament to the frustration and empathy he carried. Even with billions at his disposal, with vast networks of power, there were limitations to what could be controlled, and the awareness of that limitation pressed heavily upon him. He reached down, brushing a stray lock of hair from Lily's forehead. "I know, little one," he murmured softly, his voice low and comforting. "It's not perfect, but I promise you, I'll make sure you're safe, always, and we'll make it through this together." Lily's eyes, glistening with the reflection of hope and trust, met his, and for a moment, the world outside, the social media uproar, the scrutiny of public opinion, the chaos of justice and accountability, fell away. In that intimate gaze, there was reassurance, protection, and the unspoken promise of unwavering care. The lobby, once filled with noise and cameras, faded into a quiet frame in Simon's mind. Helen's protests, though still audible, became a distant echo, a reminder of how fragile appearances could be and how irrelevant they were in the face of true moral courage and protective instinct. The narrative had shifted. It was no longer about wealth, image, or status. It was about the safety of a child, the integrity of those who acted to protect her, and the lessons of responsibility and empathy that extended far beyond any contract or business transaction. As night deepened over the city, the lights of the skyline reflecting in the tall glass windows of Simon's office, he allowed himself a brief exhale. Relief, quiet but profound, filled the space where tension had previously resided. Lily leaned against him, small and warm, and Simon understood with clarity that while the journey ahead might involve bureaucracy, oversight, and temporary discomfort, the core truth was unshakable. The child was safe, loved, and now surrounded by adults committed to her well-being in a way Helen had never been. And in that moment, Simon realized that the power to protect, to intervene, to act decisively and morally, was infinitely more significant than any contract, any public perception, or any social maneuver. True victory was measured in the quiet trust of a child's hand, the peace in her eyes, and the knowledge that kindness, courage, and steadfast moral action could alter a life irrevocably and beautifully. The social worker adjusted her paperwork carefully, glancing at Lily, who clutched Simon's hand tightly. Her small body tense with a mix of curiosity, fear, and the lingering residue of confusion from the tumultuous events that had just unfolded. Simon knelt beside her, his presence steadying, grounding, a quiet assurance that, despite everything, she was safe. The lobby, usually bustling with controlled activity and polite exchanges, was now filled with a tense, expectant silence. It was in that fragile stillness that the receptionist, a petite woman with an attentive expression and a phone cradled against her shoulder, called up with urgency. "Sir, there's someone here, an older woman. She says she was Lily's nanny, the one who was sick." Her voice trailed off, uncertainty mixing with surprise. The words hung in the air like a sudden gust of wind, unsettling yet carrying the possibility of resolution. Simon's brow furrowed slightly, his calm composure tightening. "Show her in," he said softly, his voice measured but filled with unspoken anticipation. He rose, brushing his suit and adjusting his tie, and stepped back, allowing the woman to enter the lobby. The door opened, and an older woman stepped in, her eyes red from crying. Her hands shaking slightly as if the very act of entering this corporate space was both a necessity and a torment. She moved quickly, driven by a mix of urgency and relief, her gaze locking onto Lily. "Lily," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Oh, my sweet girl." The words were a balm, a recognition, a claim not of possession but of love, long deferred but never extinguished. Lily's eyes widened, a flicker of recognition igniting within her. She wavered for a moment, unsure, but then her small arms shot forward, wrapping tightly around the woman who had been a constant in her life, a true mother figure in every way that mattered. Maria, because Simon already knew instinctively. And soon everyone in the room would learn, held the child close, pressing her cheek to Lily's hair, letting the tears fall freely. The child's small arms tightened, squeezing Maria with desperate relief, as if anchoring herself to a lifeline finally revealed. The sound of their sobs, soft but profound, filled the room with a quiet, aching beauty, the catharsis of reunion, the validation of enduring love. Simon's eyes softened, his lips pressing together as he watched. He had prepared to shield Lily from a world of neglect, yet this moment transcended mere protection. It was restoration. It was the unmasking of truth in its purest form. He took a quiet step back, giving them space while remaining close, an unseen but unwavering guardian. Maria's gaze, once filled with sorrow and anxiety, hardened slightly as she addressed the room, her voice gaining strength from the truth she had carried for so long. "I wasn't sick," she said, her eyes glistening but unwavering. "Helen fired me because Lily loved me more than she liked, more than she wanted anyone to love. She was jealous of our bond, and she wanted complete control. She never loved Lily. She never loved her at all." Gasps echoed through the lobby as the gravity of her revelation sank in. Helen, standing at a distance with her head bowed and hands cuffed, looked as though the air itself had shifted, the weight of exposure pressing down upon her inescapably. Maria continued, her voice gaining a cadence of both pain and resolution. "Lily isn't Helen's biological child. She was adopted by Helen's late husband. I am her biological aunt. After her father died, I stayed close, hired as her nanny, to ensure she had someone to love her, to watch over her, to protect her from people who would exploit her." The revelation struck everyone like a lightning bolt. The calculated greed, the jealousy, the exploitation, it all became painfully clear. Helen had not only failed to provide love, care, or protection, she had been using Lily as a paycheck, as a means to secure trust fund payments and maintain an illusion of wealth and status. Those payments recently stopped explained the panic, the desperation, and the unraveling of her composed facade. The depth of her moral bankruptcy, previously evident only in glimpses, now stood fully exposed. Simon's chest tightened with a mixture of sorrow, indignation, and a profound resolve. He realized, in that instant, the scale of the evil Helen had perpetrated. Not just neglect, but exploitation of innocence for personal gain. His mind worked swiftly. Legal options, protective measures, custody arrangements. All the resources he commanded as CEO and philanthropist surged forward with urgency. He knew what needed to happen. Maria needed to be empowered, legitimized, and given full custody. Lily needed security, permanence, and love, true, unshakable love, not conditional or transactional. Simon immediately mobilized his legal team. His voice, calm but resolute, carried across the lobby. "We will support Maria fully. We will ensure her rights as Lily's guardian are recognized legally, and we will fund every step of the process to establish custody properly. Lily will have a home, stability, and the family she deserves." Marcus, standing nearby, nodded, already coordinating with lawyers and social workers to expedite proceedings, understanding the gravity and the human urgency of the moment. Meanwhile, Maria held Lily close, whispering words of reassurance, soft yet insistent. "You're safe now, my darling. No one will ever hurt you again. You're mine, and I am yours. Always." Lily's small fingers clutched Maria's blouse tightly, pressing her face to her chest, feeling warmth, security, and unconditional love for the first time in years. Her tears, previously tinged with fear and confusion, now carried relief and unspoken joy. Simon watched from a respectful distance, a solitary tear sliding down his cheek, not of sorrow for his own struggles or triumphs, but for the beauty of justice finally realized. He observed the reunion with silent reverence, the emotional alchemy that transformed fear into security, despair into hope, and vulnerability into belonging. He understood deeply that this was the culmination of every careful decision, every intervention, every moment he had acted not for power, but for the quiet, enduring protection of someone who could not advocate for herself. In that moment, the world outside, the social media uproar, the financial machinations, the corporate ambitions, faded. What remained was human connection in its purest, most poignant form. Lily had found her true family, Maria had reclaimed her niece, and justice, patient and deliberate, had been served fully. Simon's hand brushed briefly against Lily's as she leaned against Maria. A small gesture of ongoing support, a silent promise that the protection would continue, steadfast and unwavering. The lobby, once a stage for greed, ambition, and pretense, had transformed into a sanctuary of truth and love. And as Simon stepped back, allowing the two to share the space they deserved, he knew, with clarity and satisfaction, that the world could witness countless failures, but true justice, the kind rooted in care, morality, and courage, was finally realized here, in the quiet strength of a child reunited with her rightful guardian. 6 months had passed since the storm of revelations, legal battles, an emotional upheaval that had upended lives in the polished, corporate corridors of SS Company. Time had a quiet way of smoothing the sharp edges of chaos, allowing growth to emerge where once only fear and greed had festered. In the warehouse of SS Company, the hum of conveyor belts and the rhythmic shuffle of work boots filled the air. The warehouse was no longer just a place for packing boxes. It had become a sanctuary of humility, diligence, and personal reckoning. Helen moved along the line, her movements precise but cautious, her hands guided by instruction and newly acquired respect for labor. Her expensive shoes had been replaced by practical ones, her delicate designer dress swapped for a uniform that was functional and unassuming. Even her hair, once styled for social appearances, now rested naturally around her face, soft and untamed. Her makeup was gone, leaving her skin exposed in its raw reality, reflecting every line of stress, every trace of vanity surrendered to the weight of learning humility. The air smelled faintly of cardboard, shipping tape, and the faint tang of metal machinery, a scent she had once derided as beneath her status, but now it had become familiar, almost grounding. Helen's hands moved methodically, folding boxes, labeling them, and carefully setting them in place for shipment. Each task, though simple, demanded attention and care, a sharp contrast to the reckless entitlement she had displayed just months before. She paused for a moment, inhaling deeply, feeling the texture of the boxes beneath her fingertips. There was dignity here in the quiet effort, in the tangible results of honest labor. She caught herself reflecting on how much she had taken for granted, how much she had assumed her status entitled her to, and how hollow her life had felt under the pretense of sophistication and wealth. Simon entered the warehouse without announcement. He walked with a quiet purpose, his tailored suit incongruous against the industrial setting. Yet he moved with a sense of calm observation rather than judgment. Helen spotted him across the room, her eyes immediately dropping to the floor. Shame, genuine and deep, washed over her, accompanied by a pang of regret that seemed to tighten around her chest. She lowered her head, her shoulders stooped not from fatigue, but from the weight of realization, the profound understanding that her actions, her choices, and her callous disregard for Lily's well-being had left scars that no amount of money or status could erase. Simon watched silently, his expression unreadable but his eyes gentle, filled with a quiet affirmation that he was present not to mock, but to ensure that the lesson had taken root. Helen continued her work, folding, labeling, and stacking with meticulous care. Each movement an unspoken apology, a silent recognition of the person she had wronged, and a tentative step toward personal redemption. She felt the sting of her mistakes, but in the clarity of honest labor, she also felt the first hints of transformation. In this space, surrounded by the hum of machinery and the understated diligence of her colleagues, she began to grasp the concept of value beyond wealth and image. Here, effort itself was a currency, and humility a reward. Simon departed the warehouse after a measured inspection, leaving Helen to her reflection and her tasks. He traveled next to a modest yet charming home nestled in a quiet neighborhood where Maria and Lily now lived. The house was warm, its paint slightly faded, its garden tended with care, a space of love cultivated with patience and devotion rather than opulence. Simon entered the home quietly, observing the domestic tranquility, the soft laughter of Lily playing on the floor, and Maria moving with gentle attentiveness. His eyes caught the small details, the hand-sewn curtains, the stack of well-worn storybooks, the carefully arranged dining table, all signs of a life built on care rather than money, on love rather than performance. Lily, spotting Simon in the doorway, ran toward him with a burst of energy that seemed to fill the room with sunlight. In her small hands, she carried a drawing she had made, vibrant colors streaking across the paper, a figure soaring into the sky. The figure was unmistakably a superhero. Yet, unlike the caped crusaders of comic books, this hero wore a suit, its color rich and dignified, and the skin was brown, reflecting the man before her. Lily's eyes sparkled with pride and admiration as she thrust the drawing toward him. "Look, this is you! You're my superhero!" she exclaimed, her voice bright and unself-conscious. Simon knelt down to her level, the same way he had that day in the mall, his presence steady, calm, and reassuring. He took the drawing gently in his hands, studying it with a warm smile. "This is incredible, Lily," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of encouragement and the lightness of joy. He placed a hand on her shoulder, feeling the small, firm pressure of her trust. You know, being a superhero isn't about capes or powers. The real superpower is kindness. The real superpower is helping someone who can't help themselves, protecting those who are vulnerable, and choosing love over fear. Lily nodded solemnly, absorbing the lesson. The essence of the heroism that had quietly shaped her life through Simon's actions. The afternoon sunlight poured through the windows, casting long, warm shadows across the living room floor. Simon stood at the threshold, watching Maria and Lily interact. A tableau of healing, trust, and familial bond forming before his eyes. He felt a quiet satisfaction, not born of triumph over others, but of the simple knowledge that he had transformed a moment of injustice, hatred, and neglect into a foundation of hope, security, and love. This was the victory that mattered, the one measured not in wealth, power, or social standing, but in the restoration of innocence and the creation of a future where a child could flourish. As he stepped outside, the setting sun painted the sky in rich hues of gold and crimson, his silhouette framed against the brilliance, a symbol of the enduring impact of courage, compassion, and moral resolve. Simon walked away slowly, his mind at peace, knowing that a moment of hatred had been turned into a lifetime of hope, and that justice, tempered by empathy, had found its truest expression. The world in its chaos had yielded a rare and profound victory, the victory of human dignity, moral courage, and the enduring power of love. If you found this story moving and inspiring, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more tales that touch the heart, reveal hidden truths, and celebrate courage and kindness in the face of adversity.